The divorce was finalized. The silence afterward felt like freedom, until one phone call shattered it. A woman who was no longer family reached out with urgency, claiming there was a hospital emergency and that money was needed immediately. No concern, no apology, just pressure. Old wounds reopened in seconds, dragging the past back into the present. Something about the call felt wrong, too sudden, too demanding, too convenient. What was really happening behind those hospital walls? And why, after everything that had already been taken, were they asking for more? Life after the divorce was far from easy, but it was finally stable. The paperwork was signed, the arguments were over, and the constant emotional exhaustion had begun to fade. Days were quieter now, focused on rebuilding, work, routine, and small moments of peace that once felt impossible. There was no contact anymore, no shared responsibilities, no reason to look back. The marriage had ended after years of imbalance, giving more than receiving, carrying financial burdens that were never truly shared, promises that dissolved into expectations. Walking away had been painful but necessary. It was the first decision made purely for survival. That was why the phone call felt so unsettling. It came without warning, from a number long deleted. The urgency in the message cut through the calm like a knife. A sudden illness, a hospital bed, a demand framed as responsibility. The past was reaching out again, refusing to stay buried. There was no context, no explanation of how things had escalated so quickly, only the assumption that help would be given, as if nothing had changed, as if the divorce meant nothing, as if the boundaries drawn so carefully no longer existed. The mind began racing, replaying memories that were supposed to be over. Patterns became visible again, the entitlement, the pressure, the expectation of sacrifice without question, and beneath it all lingered a single unsettling thought. This was never really about an emergency, it was about control. As details slowly emerged, the story behind the emergency became less clear. The condition was described vaguely, shifting with each explanation. One moment it sounded critical, the next moment stable. Timelines didn't match. Hospital names were mentioned casually without specifics. The urgency remained constant, but the facts did not. Requests turned into insistence. The tone hardened. Responsibility was implied, then outright assigned. It was suggested that help was owed, that the past somehow obligated the present. The divorce in their minds had ended the marriage, but not the benefits. The pressure intensified. Guilt was weaponized. Emotional manipulation resurfaced in familiar patterns. Memories flooded back of moments where boundaries were ignored, finances drained, and sacrifices dismissed as duty. The same cycle was repeating, just dressed in the language of crisis. Doubt grew stronger with every interaction. Why had no one else stepped in? Why was the burden placed on someone who was no longer part of that family? Why did the request feel rehearsed rather than desperate? A decision was made to verify the situation. What followed was a slow, unsettling unraveling. Information didn't align. The hospital records were incomplete. The severity of the condition appeared exaggerated. What was presented as a life or death emergency began to resemble something else entirely, a calculated attempt to regain access to money that was no longer available. Anger replaced confusion, not just anger at the demand, but at the realization that even after the divorce, autonomy was still being challenged. The past was not done asking, it wanted more. Each moment of clarity brought a heavier emotional weight. This wasn't an isolated request, it was a test of whether independence would hold, or whether guilt could still override self-preservation. And then came the final push, a deadline, an ultimatum. The demand sharpened, removing all pretense of concern. In that moment, the truth became undeniable. The realization hit with painful clarity. The emergency was real, but the desperation was not. The situation had been manipulated, magnified, and strategically framed to provoke fear and compliance. What mattered wasn't the hospital, the illness, or even the outcome. What mattered was access. Years of emotional conditioning made the moment heavy. Saying no felt like breaking a rule that had existed for far too long. The pressure was intense, the guilt suffocating. But something had changed. The divorce had created distance, and with distance came perspective. For the first time, the patterns were impossible to ignore. The expectation of sacrifice without consent, the assumption of endless giving, the absence of accountability. This wasn't an emergency, it was exploitation resurfacing in its most familiar form. Standing firm felt terrifying. There was fear of judgment, backlash, and emotional retaliation. But beneath that fear was something stronger: clarity. The understanding that helping under manipulation is not kindness, it is surrender. The decision was final. Boundaries were reinforced, not explained, not justified, simply enforced. The response was cold, immediate, and revealing. Concern disappeared, gratitude never appeared. The reaction confirmed everything that had been suspected. In that moment, the emotional weight lifted, not because the situation was resolved, but because the cycle had been broken. The past had made its last demand, and it was refused. The call ended, but its impact lingered, not with regret, only reflection. The realization that some relationships don't end with distance alone. They end when boundaries are finally respected, even if that respect is forced. Life didn't change overnight, but something fundamental shifted. There was peace in knowing that manipulation no longer worked, strength in choosing self-preservation over obligation. Healing doesn't always come from forgiveness, it often comes from clarity. This wasn't just one story about a phone call or money, it was about the lasting effects of emotional control and the courage required to walk away from it completely. Many people leave relationships but remain trapped by guilt, expectation, and fear long after. True freedom comes when those invisible chains are broken. The question is not whether help should be given, but whether help is being demanded through pressure rather than honesty. How many people are still paying emotional debts to relationships that no longer exist? Sometimes the most powerful act isn't giving more, it's finally saying no.